It was the morning of my 68th Thanksgiving, and my daughter was making me coffee I hadn't asked for. That should have been enough of a sign. I sat at her kitchen table, the one she and her husband bought when they moved into the house I helped them pay for, and I watched her move around the kitchen with a kind of deliberate cheerfulness that I hadn't seen in years. Not since her mother's funeral, when she'd worn the same expression, bright eyes, busy hands, mouth slightly too curved at the corners. The look of someone managing something. "You seem happy," I said. "It's Thanksgiving, Dad." She set the mug down in front of me. "We're all together." Her husband, my son-in-law, came in from the garage carrying a bag of ice nobody needed. He nodded at me the way he always did, quick, tight, like acknowledging a debt he didn't want to discuss. "Good drive up?" he asked. "Not bad," I said. "Roads were clear." He nodded again, put the ice in the freezer, and left the room. I wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the window at their backyard, the dead November grass, the swing set their kids never used anymore. I thought about the call I'd received 11 days ago. The one from my old accountant Neil, who had retired 2 years back but still had friends at the firm that handled my affairs. Neil had called on a Tuesday afternoon. I'd been raking leaves in the backyard of my own house. The house I'd lived in for 31 years. The house where I'd raised my daughter and her younger brother. The house where my wife Meredith had spent her last 6 months before the cancer took her. "I heard something," Neil said. "I don't know if it's nothing or something, but I heard your son-in-law made some calls to a notary about a power of attorney." I kept raking. "What kind of calls?" "The kind where he's asking what documentation he'd need if a parent were incapacitated, or," Neil paused, "if a parent were deemed to be having memory difficulties." I set the rake against the fence. I sat down on the back steps. The leaves I'd piled were starting to scatter in the wind. "When?" I said. "About 3 weeks ago. I thought it was probably nothing, but then I heard he also called a real estate lawyer about the process of selling a property held by someone under financial guardianship. The temperature was 4 degrees that afternoon. I hadn't noticed until that moment. I want to be honest about what I felt sitting on those steps. It wasn't rage. Not yet. What I felt first was something quieter and worse than rage. It was the particular grief of recognizing a thing you'd been half suspecting for years but had worked very hard not to look at directly. My daughter had always been good at the performance of love, the calls on birthdays, the visits at Christmas, the concerned questions about my cholesterol and my sleep, and her husband had always been in financial trouble. Not disaster, not ruin, but the persistent low-grade trouble of a man who spent slightly more than he made and borrowed slightly more than he admitted. I'd helped them 4 times over the years. A down payment, a car, a line of credit when his business went sideways, a loan they'd never formally repaid, which had eventually just become a gift because I hadn't wanted the conversations it would have required to call it anything else. After the call from Neil, I called my own lawyer. His name is James Whitmore, and he has an office on Spring Garden Road in Halifax, where I'd moved after I sold my logistics company. I'd worked with James for 12 years. I trusted him the way you trust someone who has seen your worst decisions and helped you survive them. I told James what Neil had told me. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How liquid are you right now?" "About $840,000, I said, "between the sale of the company and the investment account." "I want you to come in tomorrow," he said, "and I want you to bring every document you have." I came in the next morning. We spent 4 hours at his conference table. By the time I left, the structure of my finances had changed in ways that would take considerable legal effort to unwind. James had also drafted a letter that I signed, witnessed, and left with him in a sealed envelope with instructions for when to open it. Then I drove home, called my daughter, and accepted her Thanksgiving invitation. I want you to understand that I didn't know for certain. I want to be careful about that. You don't always know for certain. What I knew was that something was off. What I knew was that the people who loved you were capable of also planning around you, and that sometimes the planning happened while they were smiling, and the coffee was hot, and the table was set, and the house smelled like turkey. So I sat at their kitchen table on Thanksgiving morning, and I said nothing, and I waited. Around 11 o'clock, her husband said he had to run to the store. We were out of cranberry sauce, he said. My daughter said that was fine, she'd keep me company, and she said it in the particular tone of someone who had already been told to say exactly that. "I'll come with you," I said. "I could use some air." "Oh, stay, Dad. It's cold. We've barely talked." I looked at her. Her hands were doing the same thing they did when she was 12 and had broken something and was deciding whether to lie. Slightly too still, slightly too deliberate. "All right," I said. Her husband left. I heard his truck back out of the driveway. My daughter made more coffee neither of us needed. She told me about the kids' hockey schedules and her sister-in-law's new house and something that had happened at her book club that I found difficult to follow because part of my attention was on the sound of my own heartbeat, which had gotten very loud in the way it does when you are trying very hard to appear calm. 40 minutes later, her husband came back. He came through the front door and he stopped in the entrance hallway, and his face did something I had not expected to see on a grown man's face. It was the face of someone who had walked into a room to collect the thing and found the room completely empty. "Everything okay?" my daughter called from the kitchen. He didn't answer right away. "Grant," she said, and then louder, "What happened?" He appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was holding a bag from the grocery store, but he'd set it down somewhere between the door and the kitchen and arrived without it. His eyes went to me first, then to my daughter. "There's nothing there," he said. She put her coffee mug down. "What do you mean?" "The account. I went to the bank first before the store, and there's nothing." He stopped. He looked at me again. Whatever he saw in my face told him something, because the color left his in about 3 seconds. My daughter turned to look at me too. I didn't say anything for a moment. I had rehearsed this in the car on the drive up, and in the shower that morning, and at 3 in the morning, in their guest bedroom where I'd lain awake listening to the house settle. I had thought about what I wanted to say, and how I wanted to say it, and whether I wanted to be angry or controlled or cold. What came out was quieter than I expected. "I've known for 11 days, I said. The kitchen was very still. Outside, a car passed on the street. One of the kids was moving around upstairs, probably on a game, and the sound was distant and ordinary and had nothing to do with any of this. Dad, don't," I said. "Just let me say this." She closed her mouth. I told them what I knew. I told them about the notary and the real estate lawyer and the calls that had been made 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. I told them what Neil had heard and what James Whitmore had helped me do in response. I told them that the investment account they had apparently visited that morning had been restructured 2 weeks ago into a trust that neither of them had any legal relationship to, and that my house, which I believed they had also looked into selling, was held under a structure that would require a court order and a full competency assessment to touch, which I had already preemptively ensured would go in a particular direction should it ever be requested. My son-in-law sat down in one of the kitchen chairs. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands. My daughter stood by the counter and cried, not the kind of crying you do when you're sad, the kind you do when something hasn't worked and you don't know what to do next. I watched her for a moment. I want to tell you that I felt nothing, but that's not true. I felt something very specific, which was the feeling of loving someone and also seeing them clearly at the same time and understanding that both of those things were going to have to be true at once from now on. "How long," I said, "has this been the plan?" She didn't answer. "Was it before your mother died or after?" "After," she said quietly. "It was after." I nodded. I didn't know whether that made it better or worse. I decided it didn't matter. "There are some things you should know," I said. "The first is that I have already spoken to an estate lawyer, and the documents we signed 3 weeks after your mother's funeral, the ones where you were made co-executor, those have been amended. You are still in my will. I didn't remove you from my will. I want you to understand that. I'm not punishing you. I'm protecting myself." She looked up. "The second thing," I said, "is that James Whitmore has a sealed letter in his office that I wrote 11 days ago, describing everything I know about what the two of you plan to do. It is dated and witnessed. If anything happens to my finances, my health, or my legal standing over the next several years, in a way that benefits either of you, that letter becomes the basis of a complaint to the RCMP, not a conversation, not a family meeting. A complaint." My son-in-law raised his head. "You do that to your own family. You made a plan to have me declared mentally incompetent so you could sell my house while I was sitting at your Thanksgiving table," I said. "I think we have different definitions of what doing something to your family means." He looked away. "The third thing," I said, "is that I love my grandchildren and I intend to remain in their lives. And so for their sake, I am willing to have a relationship with both of you that functions. But it will function on my terms. And the first of those terms is that we never pretend this didn't happen." My daughter wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked very young suddenly. She looked like the girl who used to come to me after bad dreams and stand in the doorway of our bedroom until I noticed her. I had always noticed her. "Why?" I said, not angrily, just as a question I actually wanted the answer to. "I would have helped you, if you'd asked me. I've helped you before." "We were embarrassed," she said. "We owe you so much already." "So your solution was to take everything." She didn't answer that either. I stayed for Thanksgiving dinner because I had promised my grandchildren I would be there, and because leaving would have raised questions I didn't want to answer. In front of 2 kids under 12 who had done nothing wrong, we sat around the table and passed the dishes, and someone said what they were grateful for, as we always did. And when my turn came, I said I was grateful for clarity. And my son-in-law stared at his plate, and my daughter stared at his glass. And my grandson asked if clarity was a thing, and I said yes, I thought it was probably the most important thing. I drove home the next morning. It was a clear day, cold and bright the way November can be in Nova Scotia when it decides to behave. I stopped at Tim Hortons outside Truro and sat in the parking lot with a coffee, and I called Neil. "It went the way you thought?" he asked. "It went the way I prepared for," I said. "You okay?" I thought about that for a moment. The parking lot was half empty. A woman was loading a toddler into a car seat across from me. Someone had left a cart in the middle of a parking space. Normal things, ordinary morning things that had nothing to do with what I'd just been through, and everything to do with the life I was going back to. "I think so," I said. "I think I will be." I drove the rest of the way home with the radio on and the heater running and the low winter sun coming through the windshield at an angle that lit up all the dust on the dashboard. Meredith always used to say that when the light hit dust like that, it looked like someone had shaken snow over everything. She said it like it was beautiful, which at the time I hadn't quite understood, but sitting in that car on that particular morning, I thought I finally did. When I got home, I made tea and I sat at my own kitchen table, the one Meredith and I picked out together at an estate sale in Dartmouth, the one with the burn mark on the corner from a candle we left too long one Christmas Eve. And I looked around at my own house, my own things, the life I had built and earned and protected, and I thought about what it means to get old in a world that sometimes looks at you and sees a resource rather than a person. I thought about all the people who didn't have a Neil or a James, all the people who sat at that Thanksgiving table and didn't already know, all the people whose children had a different kind of Thanksgiving. I'm not telling this story to make my daughter the villain. She made a choice that was wrong, and I will not pretend otherwise, but she is still my daughter. And I have chosen to believe that people can understand what they have done if you give them the room to live with it. I don't know if I'm right about that. I suppose I'll find out. What I do know is that the house is still mine, the account is still mine, the life is still mine. And when the light hits the dust on the dashboard just right, it still looks like someone shook snow over everything. That belongs to me too. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened at that Thanksgiving table. And the thing I keep coming back to isn't the betrayal. It's the coffee. She made it without asking. Set it down in front of me like she was already managing me. And I sat there and I accepted it. And in that small moment I understood something I hadn't let myself understand in a long time. That the people who love you can also be planning around you. And sometimes those two things exist in the same person at the same time, and neither one cancels the other out. My son-in-law walked back through that front door expecting to find an old man who didn't know what was happening. What he found instead was a man who had spent 11 days quietly making sure that nothing he reached for would be there. I don't say that to brag. I say it because I think there's something important in the difference between those two versions of me, the one they imagined and the one who was actually sitting at that table. The version they imagined was someone whose age had made him passive, whose grief after losing Meredith had made him easy, whose history of helping them had made him a resource rather than a person. And I understand, in a way I wish I didn't, how that version of me had become plausible to them. I had been generous in ways that didn't require them to ask. I had made things easy when easy wasn't always what the situation called for. In some ways, I had participated in the story they were telling about me without realizing it. That's the part that took me the longest to sit with. Not what they did, but what I had allowed to slowly become the shape of our relationship without ever calling it by its name. When James and I sat at his conference table that Wednesday morning and restructured everything, it wasn't just a legal exercise. It was an act of deciding to remain a person with agency. To say, I am still here. I still see clearly. I still know the difference between what is mine and what someone else is reaching for. That kind of clarity doesn't come from anger. It comes from paying attention over a long period of time and finally choosing to act on what you've been seeing. What my daughter and her husband mistook for complacency was actually patience, and what they thought was vulnerability was actually a man who had spent 40 years building something carefully and wasn't about to let one bad season undo it. I still talk to my daughter. It's different now. Quieter, more careful, with a kind of honesty we probably should have had years ago. She knows I see her. I think that's uncomfortable for her, and I think discomfort is sometimes the beginning of something better. The account is still mine, the house is still mine, and every time I sit at my own kitchen table, the one with the burn mark from that Christmas candle, I think about what it means to stay awake to your own life. To not let grief or generosity or the desire to keep the peace talk you out of knowing exactly where you stand. That's what I'd want anyone to take from this. Not the legal steps, not the specific details, but the simpler thing underneath all of it. Stay awake. Keep your own counsel, and don't let anyone, no matter how much you love them, convince you that paying attention to your own life is somehow an act of unkindness. The light still hits the dust on the dashboard the way Meredith always said it did. That's still mine too.